Thank you all for your patience. Main Deck is back at last. Our technical issues are resolved, and in the interim, we traveled to Grand Archives Ascent Santa Clara, where we all brought the same deck. Well, most of us brought the same deck. I think 8 of us submitted Mill Arisanna, and of course, as many of you know, Maindeck Mitch won Ascent Santa Clara first place with this deck. So in this video, we're going to go over the deck profile, sort of briefly, just kind of go through all the cards as quickly as we can, explain the deck concept to you, how you win, what the combos are, and then we'll have a follow-up video that's going to release the day after this. So when you're watching, it might already be up. It'll be linked at the end. If so, that is going to be our deep dive with myself, Maindeck Mitch, who is of course first place again, and Maindeck Taylor, who took 15th place, I believe, if I'm remembering right, in the tournament as well. And we'll just go through like a lot more strategy and depths and matchup knowledge and stuff in that video. This video is just going to be the brief, here's what the deck is. So let's jump right into it. What's up, everyone? It's Dan with Maindeck, back finally again with this Grand Archive Ascent profile for our first place Mill Arisanna from Ascent Santa Clara, piloted by Mitch, myself, and 6 other people on the team. And of course, I have to shout out Mitch, of course, winning, Taylor getting 15th place, Kinship on the main deck team getting 11th place, and I had a day 2 record, but due to a judge inputting the score wrong, I didn't unfortunately make day 2. We'll talk more about that on the upcoming podcast episode. I'm not bitter about it or anything at all. Unfortunately, it happens and it was on me. I gotta make sure I check my score. Always double check your score the round that it is input. But let's jump into this deck list so we can stop kind of messing around. We got a lot to go through here. I'm gonna try to make this as brief as possible. There are other teams who also brought this deck. You may have already seen True Champion Gaming's video on this list as well. If not, you should watch that too to get their input. We'll have a link to that in the description so you can go check out another great player bringing their version of this deck. And there's some other players like Cactus and Matt G who are on this list. It felt really good, honestly. It felt really good going to this tournament and then finding out that some of the best players in the game were also on this list. I really like the list we brought, but there was one modification we made when I played in the Scrub Out event in day 2. We talked a lot after day 1 about a change, so stay tuned towards midway or towards the end of the video. I'll show you the modification and the version that I would play right now if I were taking this list, because there's a card we just don't like too much in it. But anyway, Mill Arisanna, what is this deck? This is probably the most, I think Caben said it in an interview that day as well, the most controlling deck we have in Grand Archive. This is the first thing that really feels like a TCG control deck in the game. And that is due almost entirely to Arisanna, Water, and Polaris being the huge gain that Arisanna had from Proxia's Vault. This basically allows Arisanna to have a board wipe built into her kit, which means that against so many decks that this deck might normally struggle against, she is able to always have an answer to clear the board efficiently, get a lot of value off of taking the opponent's things off of the board while she is just trying to play towards one of her combo win cons. So this is a sort of a combo control deck. The idea is a lot of your deck is going to be playing to just control the board, control the game, control the damage you've taken. But then you have a bunch of these lines that are just going to allow you to win the game, and a huge spike potential. Actually, you can actually win games on turn 3. Watch Maindeck Mitch's gameplay to see that happen. Day 2, yeah, day 2. He had a wonderful finals game where he showed off the true spike potential of the deck as well. But just briefly, the combos in this deck are Icebound Slam into Icebound Slam. That's how you win the game turn 3 if the opponent doesn't respect it and chooses not to level or doesn't put a Nullifying Lantern in play. And then Icebound Slam into Stratagem works really well. Even if they level, if you happen to get lucky and mill 4 float off of the Icebound Slam, then you can use Stratagem to banish that float and then do another 12 damage to your opponent. And then the big thing is that a lot of these combos are really going to operate around this card here, Fractal of Polar Depths. Absolutely insane card. Why is this card so good? This mills a bunch of cards, and the way the math works out, you can, with a couple copies of this, under certain thresholds, just mill your opponent's deck out. Really, fairly easily, actually. With 2 copies of it, 20 cards in your yard, which is a lot, and that's not always super easy to get to, but you can do that with the rest of the cards in your deck. If the game goes long, 2 of them will mill your opponent out. But the big, powerful play with this is 3 copies of Fractal Polar Depths, will allow you to fully mill your opponent out from around 10 cards in your graveyard, which is kind of crazy. The reason this works this way, and kind of the big way you want to play this card, is that it can be sacrificed in response to itself. So the sacrifice will put the ability to mill on the trigger. So if you have 3 Polar Depths out and you have, for example, 9 cards in your yard, let's just say 9, you can sack all 3 before any of them resolve, making the number of cards in your yard 12. And then you target yourself with the first one to mill yourself 12 to go to 24. Target your opponents with the ones that resolve afterwards. So then they mill 24, then they mill another 24. 48 cards, they're out of the game at that point. So that's kind of the big thing to know. The other thing to know about this is it's reservable for some reason. It makes it super powerful. But the fact that it's reservable allows you to do things like play a stratagem and then use the fractal to pay for one of the reserve of the stratagem. And then after you've, with the stratagem on the stack, but after you've paid for it, then you can sacrifice the Polar Depths to mill yourself to kind of find the float that you need to get the kill. So that opens up tons and tons of lines. I've seen people play this deck who don't quite understand those lines, and then they have trouble because they're not finding the wins as efficiently. And you really have to know how the math works and know what you're doing to maximize finding those kills, because if with Grand Archive, if you can't find the kill, sometimes the opponent gets it on the next turn. That's pretty common in this game. So you got to know what you're doing. Definitely. I know we talked to Matt G and Cactus and some of the others, and they had the same sentiment we did, which is that this feels like the old Erupting deck before Erupting got banned, but it's in water now. Instead, it's water version of Erupting, which is really cool, really powerful. And the reason it feels that way is because of these combos and because of all the math that you are just doing to kind of figure out, okay, how do I win this turn? Can I win this turn? No, I can't. All right, what do I do instead? And then you do that every turn, turn after turn, until you win the game. The rest of the deck is really built around controlling, though. That's the big advantage this has over the old Erupting deck, is that instead of kind of just playing cards to draw cards the whole time, you're going to be playing cards that actually actively control what your opponent is doing, something that Fire could never really do. So we have a number of things that are going to help with that. We have Refracting Missile, way to deal damage. By the way, there's 27 float in this list, 30 float in the one I'm going to show you in a minute, the one that we started playing day 2, the one we would switch to. But a lot of these cards that are going to be control element cards are also floating memory, and that's what really makes the deck work. Was 27 float in there or 30 float in there, you are so consistent on finding that float with Polar Depths to turn on stratagem. That's how you get those fast kills. So Refracting Missile will deal damage to things or sneaky kills on your opponent. You can line up damage with this and things like Frostborn Paladin to intercept attacks, or again, just to push damage. You have Awakened Deacon, another card that just intercepts attacks and has floating memory. We have Revitalizing Cleanse, just 2 of, but we side in a bunch of control elements, including 2 more Revitalizing. Huge for just not losing the game against Fire aggro decks. Solid against slimes, solid against allies. It's great. Good stuff. 4 copies of Tidal Lock, absolutely insane. Counter card, it's so easy to get the condition set up, and then it just costs 1 and then counters unless they pay 2. A lot of times you're going to play mirror matches where it's going to revolve around who has more influence and who has more Tidal Locks to try and resolve the win con. And that is, we've tried less than 4 and we kept bringing it back up because you needed it. Torrential Blast, a card so many people during Ascent had to actually read that I played against. They weren't familiar with this, especially in Cleric, where it has the class bonus to mill 2, and then it deals damage equal to the number of water element cards to 1 target ally. So this does effectively just infinity damage to whatever you need. This kills Majestic Spirits on its own. It kills just about any ally that exists under most conditions. It's super easy to trigger. Really, really powerful card. It did side out sometimes if there just weren't a lot of allies to kill, but you can even use this on your own things as a sort of budget primordial ritual. Just to, if you need to, again, you're doing math, you're like, I just need to mill, 3 more cards in order to get this going. And then you can do that. And finally, Water Barrier, of course, just control the amount of damage that you are taking. Chilling Touch is technically a control card. Sometimes it's crazy good. Again, I think Mitch's semifinal match, that was live streamed. You should check that out because he had a Chilling Touch that hit a dungeon guide against Slimes that just totally kneecapped that player in that game. So Occasionally it's really good and just limiting their influence to limit what they can do, but mostly really good because it's a cheap floating memory. And I'm not going to go through, like, obviously, like Fracturize also, sorry, another huge control piece. It can hit just about anything, including in Arisanna. It can hit your own herbs, which you can use to up your influence in a game. But yeah, we don't need to like go into like, I think, super detail on all of these cards. But the big thing you need to know is outside of all of our floating memory and control elements, we have Fractal of Rain, a great first turn play to set up your mill so you can start self-milling and get that float going. Primordial Ritual that I mentioned, which is, again, another card for just kind of setting yourself up, works really, really well with Awakened Deacon. Not the great, I mean, it needs to have other allies in play and you want to have to sacrifice them. So it's not like a card that we wanted to play a ton of, but 3, it kind of felt pretty good. We'd find it most of the time when we needed it. And then Lost in Thought, I can't say enough good things about this card. This is maybe one of the top 10 cards in the game. I think after this weekend playing with it, it is just insane. A lot of people I see doing things that I consider in most situations the wrong play with this. I think I see too often people just going like Lost in Thought for 0 so I can play a Frostworn Paladin and then banish the Lost in Thought to level, or the Lost in Thought for 0 just to like use it as float when they didn't actually have anything important or important enough in their memory to not just like, okay, just like level out of your memory if you really have to. This card in this deck can very easily be set up to be draw 3, 4, or even 5 cards. And a lot of the time, if you're not finding your combos, this is the key. This is how you actually win the game. By setting up a Lost in Thought for 4 or 5, go to 13 influence or something. Even if you don't find your combo, then once you get to that level of influence, you have so much control over the game. You have so much ability to react to things, and you get things turned on like Revitalizing Cleanse for 12 or something, which is really, really hard to beat also. So I can't stress enough that this card is not just to pay for 0. I mean, very occasionally you'll want to do that. It might make sense in some situation where the math works out. But a lot of time, if you've got a Lost in Thought, you want to hold on to it and you want to use those giant draw turns with it. Now, that's most of the main deck, and hopefully that all makes sense. You're just going to control the game. Sometimes just push damage if you need to, but a lot of the time just control and find the kill turn, find the stratagem. You mill yourself, you're okay milling yourself 20, 30 or whatever with Polar Depths, because then that turns on stratagem. It does infinity damage. There are some key things to how you play stratagem that people do need to know. For example, stratagem actually creates triggers when it resolves, reflexive triggers. So when I play stratagem, if my opponent responds with a blanch before the stratagem resolves, I can actually then, when I resolve stratagem, set those triggers up so the first one that resolves targets their blanch and the rest targets them. However, instead, if my opponent lets me banish everything and set up the triggers, they still have the ability to respond with blanch at that point before the triggers resolve, allowing your opponent to actually react around this if they know how to do it. So just something I thought I'd mention because it's a tricky card the way it resolves, a little different than a lot of other things. But yeah, otherwise, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. The deck's really powerful because it mills itself with Icebound Slams. It stratagems for infinite damage, and then otherwise, Polar Depths, other than a Nullifying Lantern, which is really more of a speed bump than anything, there's almost no way for the opponent to interact with this because it's an activated ability on a reservable Fantasia. So they have to use a Mystic Purifier or something to destroy it, Scatter Essence, Vertigerous Decree, or, and that's before you have class bonus, because once you get class bonus up, even if they try to Purifier this, just milling yourself for like 5 is fine. That'll be good enough to kind of set up a Lost in Thought to start to find more Polar Depths or more whatever. The key way to beat this deck is play Nullifying Lantern turn 2, and that will buy you plenty of time, because then if I'm playing this deck, need to get enough Fantasia to then put out Crystalline Mirror, have class bonus, then activate Crystalline Mirror, and hope you're not playing water, and hope you don't Fracturize your Nullifying Lantern in response. Fracturize Nullifying Lantern on like turn 2 is quite a speed bump for this deck, and you then have to rely on kind of hard milling yourself to stratagem, because stratagem doesn't care what element things are. You can certainly beat a Fracturized Lantern, but that's kind of a key way. And if, of course, the opponent isn't also leveling fast enough, then you're just going to slam the opponent out of here too. So there are things that people do wrong, I think, that make this deck win more, and that's part of what makes its win rate so high right now. But also, it is really just a very robust deck. It can respond to just about any deck in the meta. It has, I'd think, about a 50% matchup at worst against everything in the meta. And it's a lot of decks like Slimes, it's very good against. Allies, it crushes. Wind allies, it crushes. Water allies, a little stronger because they have that potential with Scepter to burst more damage out. But yeah, Wind allies, it crushes. Slimes, it has a very good matchup against. We find it very good against most random decks. Luxem, Jin decks, all that stuff gets pretty crushed by it as well. Wind Arisanna, a little tougher, I would say. And depending on the Mill deck, obviously it's 50-50 against itself, with 2 players of equal skill level, but the Sylvie version of Mill can put a little... Terrapin's kind of tough to beat, so that can be a little stronger against it. But the regular Nico, we don't really care too much about. Usually it's a little too slow for this. So just looking quick then at the material deck, we did something very interesting. I think, well, a lot of people find it interesting, but we ran both Fragmented Spirit and Spirit of Water. Fragmented does allow you to put another Fantasia out, which turns on your Awakened Deacon's Intercept a little faster. It also turns on Crystalline Mirror a little sooner, which can be really good. But really what we did with this is Fragmented is what we went if we were on the play, which allowed us to dig a little deeper, glimpse a little bit, and try and find things like Fractal Rain to set up or that Icebound Slam. And if you find Slam, then the next turn, even if you play everything out that turn, you can grant Crusader's Ring to have the influence in order to play Icebound Slam on turn 2. Otherwise, you went Spirit of Water because that allows you, if you're going second, because that allows you to turn 2 Icebound Slam. And, the opponent, unless they're playing Water and happen to have the Song of Frost or the Frostbind or something, which is where that's a much riskier play, much riskier against Water. And actually against Water, you can just go Fragmented whether you're on the play or draw. And that might be a lot better anyway, because it can do things like set up your Crystalline Mirror before they find a Fracturize if they try and respect you with a Nullifying Lantern, etc. So, but most of the time in the match, we went Fragmented if you went first, and then Spirit of Water if you went second to turn on that turn 2 Icebound Slam. Landing a Slam early is huge. Slam becomes a lot harder to play late because the amount of cards in your hand is just not enough to like slam and hold up a lot of interaction until you get off that like Lost in Thought for 5 or something. And once the game goes a little later, you can't just like slam and then let your opponent go Sylvie level 3 Ethereal Double Storm Slime you, because then you just lose. So it's a little too risky to play. We tend to not play it much after about turn 3. Then it just kind of becomes reserve fodder for things until you get into a situation where you can do all the math and you're like, okay, this is probably fine to use, or you just like draw infinite cards off Lost in Thought and then you can freely slam and still hold up like 5 cards. It probably feels a little bit better. Arisanna 1 and 2. Sometimes Arisanna 1 and 2 can give you a level herb to get to draw a card off of Fragmented Spirit of Water, but honestly, like the Spirit Fragment drawing a card, it wasn't even like that important to us. You win the game without doing it a lot of the time. The fact that it's a Fantasia is actually more important than getting a level counter drawing card, which is why we did things that I think some people weren't doing, like cutting ingredient pouch. We just didn't care. Didn't care about the herbs, didn't care about the level herbs. Obviously, the herbs don't matter for Polaris necessarily. The only situation where you care to shuffle in Cosmic Bolts, you do want to bring them just for the situation, but if you're playing another mill deck and they mill you out, you can then pop a Polaris. You can you don't want to activate Polaris, you want to keep it in your material deck. Then on that turn before you draw your card, you materialize Polaris, pop your herbs, activate it, put some Cosmic Bolts in your empty deck so you can draw a Cosmic Bolt instead of losing the game. And then hopefully pop a Polar Depths, mill your opponent for their entire deck because your deck's already in the graveyard, and win the game. So that's the only thing you really do with that. Otherwise, Polaris is just here's a board wipe and you just want to use it as such. Nullifying Mirror, stopping Veiling Breeze, as well as randomly things like Merlin decks with Ascension, although Merlin's not super played right now. But Veiling Breeze obviously is really good against Stratagem, so having Nullifying Lantern is what allows you to beat Razor Gale. Otherwise, Razor Gale sometimes can be a little sketch, especially if you draw multiple Razor Gales. It's a scary match. That one's can be a little tighter. Safeguard Amulet is Safeguard Amulet. Crystalline Mirror there for destroying Nullifying Lanterns. That's the main purpose of it. That's what it's there for. But it sometimes can be a little cheeky against, like, again, Merlins or something. Scepter of Luminous against water decks. You can put this out, get that extra damage. You can close the game a lot sooner. Against other decks, you don't usually want to take a turn to put this out. You've got kind of more important stuff to materialize until later in the game when it just becomes a pay a float, draw 2, which is perfectly reasonable. Really happy to use it for that when I need to also. And then Tideholder Claymore. I didn't say backup charger. Draw a card off backup charger, power cell, you can fracturize, all that good stuff. But then Tideholder Claymore, last thing in the material deck is just a gigantic sword that becomes, you don't care, you've banished 2 float for it because it represents 15 damage on board. Don't be afraid to put this out when you're like, ooh, I can't get enough to stratagem them. Okay, if you have 2, you have 15 damage available to you if you can just crack in with these. That is a perfectly reasonable thing to do once you have 10 cards in the yard, so it's a free swing. And even before you have 10, sometimes paying 1 or 2 is perfectly fine to get that damage off, and you'll close the game a lot faster than just kind of waiting around for everything to line up to perfectly stratagem your opponent. So don't be afraid to use that. It's there just to another card to line up the math to make it all work. So that's all the deck. And then I'll talk about the sideboard in a sec. Here's the change that we made to the deck that I just want you to be aware of. But the main change here is, this is what I played in the Scrub Out event. I took out the Fragmented just because I thought I was going to be playing a lot more Water that day, mirror matches specifically, and I was testing the idea of just having more influence against the Water mirrors instead of going Fragmented. Big civil war within main deck about whether that's right or wrong. I think Fragment is maybe still the right call after playing it that way, although I don't hate having the extra influence either. That 1 extra influence is the difference sometimes between being able to pay for a title lock and not. So I don't mind it. If you fancy yourself good enough at drawing cards, go for it. I think the 2 spirits is still a pretty good place to be though. But I took that spirit out so I could put in Viridian Protective Trinket, which also gave me more game against those water decks. Huge card to sideboard if you're expecting more water. Very, very good in the mirror match. And it's something that's missing from our sideboard blatantly because we didn't expect to see this deck that day. If you do expect to play against Mill Arisanna, which you should now, then it's definitely a card you want to fit somewhere in the list. But otherwise, the major change here is Rimesoul Bishop over, I didn't talk about it at all, over Tidestone Bovine. I didn't talk about it because I don't like Tidestone Bovine. None of us actually like Tidestone Bovine after playing it in this deck. It's great in Sylvie. It is not good in Arisanna. You think it would be good. You think, oh man, it's got so much potential to mill a million cards. But realistically, when you're playing actual competitive games, that doesn't really happen very much. It just dies. It becomes a bad sink into oblivion at that point. It doesn't have the power to actually take out things that matter, like a baby gray slime that has a buff counter on it. It doesn't do appreciable damage, and actually you'd rather have something that just did 2 damage instead of doing the self-mill thing. And something that had floating memory, and something that didn't actually put you down in influence to play sometimes either, and that's Rimesoul Bishop. So we swapped these 3 out for Rimesoul Bishop, which brought our floating up to 30, which felt better, and just felt better to play every single time. Having the 2/2 actually represented a reasonable, appreciable clock on the opponent compared to the 1/2 of the Tidestone Bovine. Tidestone Bovine just died to everything, couldn't kill anything itself, and the Bishop, most importantly, has that banish card with floating memory to draw a card, meaning you can continue to put these threats out that represent damage. Think about it this way. This is a way that I would sometimes be like, oh, I need that for stratagem. But stratagem is each of your float becomes 3 damage. If you banish a float for Rimesoul Bishop, you're just losing 1 damage on the potential stratagem, but drawing a card instead, which I would take that trade-off any day. So it's totally reasonable. Don't feel too much like you gotta, I gotta keep all my float, protect it for stratagem. Put down those Rimesouls, bash in for damage, keep your card count out, kill your opponent's threats. It's so much better. So yeah, we love Rimesoul, hate Cow, definitely put these in. And then, but otherwise our board does stay the same here. Blinding Orb, Crimson, Quicksilver, 2 Cerulean, 2 Revitalizing, 2 Song of Frost. Blinding Orb and Quicksilver came in for Slimes as a way just to make sure our counters could go through against them, especially on their level 3 turn. Crimson helped against Razor Gale, because again, that matchup just got a little scary sometimes, so we like the Crimson. You can totally put in Viridian instead, or you can cut some of these for Viridian as well if you need to. Cerulean, Revitalizing Cleanse, Song of Frost, all went in against Fire Aggro just to have more things to interact with them. Cerulean, more counter spells when you need it. For example, Slimes, you might want that. The Mirror Match, you might want that. There's more ways to stop the Icebound Slam. Song of Frost, same thing. Stop the Icebound Slam. Really good against Fire Aggro. Really good against Nico. Stop the Ravishing Finales. Good random Tristan decks. Good against the Shadow Strike. Revitalizing Cleanse. when decks are pushing too much damage, it was good to bring in and just have that extra healing as well. We did toy around with some other things like Desperate Dive, which were also certainly good and reasonable options. I think there are a lot of reasonable options that you can kind of move into the main or side here as you tweak the deck to your liking, but this was what we ran, and it generally felt like it was pretty effective. So yeah, so that's going to do it. That is the Mill Arisanna deck from Ascent Santa Clara. Mitch took first place with it. So proud of him. So proud of the team in general. Team put in a lot of work to tweak this list to this point. And also huge shout out to True Champion Gaming, again, who brought the list as well. And Caven took fourth place with it, which was super, super good. And then again, Cactus and Matt G were also on this list. Incredible players. I know various members of the team got to play against them throughout the weekend as well. And it was just really fun to see a bunch of people going, you know what, I think this is actually a real deck. And now I'm very happy to say this is in fact a very real deck. It's unfortunately very expensive in the game right now because Icebound Slam is really expensive. Fractal went up a chunk. Stratagem is a little bit, but not quite as bad maybe as Nico's because you don't need things like Ravishing Finales. So hopefully that works out a little bit better. But yeah, I think the Icebound Slam is like the really big one. Things like Fracturize have gone up, but if you're going to play Water ever, you should own Fracturize. And Cerulean Decree, if you don't want to pay for this, you don't have to. Put in Desperate Dives or something instead. Or there is the new Frozen Dismissal coming from ALC Alter Edition, which should 100% be in this this list as soon as ALC Alter is out. So keep in mind, there's definitely some more tweaking to do to this list. I expect to see this to popping up a lot more in the metagame going forward. And maybe that'll be you playing it. So good luck if you do. Let me know in the comments down below what you think of this list. Do you have any questions? Anything I didn't cover quite well enough? And also tune in again. If it's already up, it'll be at the end of this video, but our main deck deep dive into this list where myself, Mitch, and Taylor are going to go through a lot of the ins and outs that I didn't cover in this supposed to be much shorter video. It's about an hour long and it should be some really good strategic content. So either stay tuned for that to come out tomorrow or click the link here at the end of the video and you can watch that too. Hope you guys enjoyed that one. Thank you so much for watching. I'm so happy to be back here doing content again for you guys. There'll be a lot more GA content coming very soon. So make sure you're subscribed if you haven't been. 2025, huge year for main deck and for GA, and I cannot wait. Thank you so much. We'll see you guys in the next one.